Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. We are delighted to have you here this afternoon. My name is Ramona Rose, and I'm head of the Archives Department here at the university. First, I'd like to welcome you and acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Tlaihli Nation. So this is a continuation of our Archival Connection speaker series, and we're very pleased that we have the support of the Office of Research and Dr. Jeff Payne to conduct this series. These talks demonstrate the connections between archival research and the connection to contemporary issues of society, and such as our presentation today on the development of really public education system in our region in the north. So before I call on Dr. Payne to introduce our speaker, who you all know, I'm sure anyway, just a few words. This presentation is about 35 minutes long, and then we'll have some time for questions. Dr. Ted Binema is going to moderate questions from the audience here. And also, it is being live streamed. So for those of you who are joining us remotely, you can also send in your questions. You can either email us directly to archives@unbc.ca, or you can also text us at 250-999-0478. And it is on live stream channel 2, in case you're wondering. And now I'd like to call on Dr. Payne to introduce our speaker.
Thanks very much, Ramona, and I too would like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territory of the Tlaihli. So this is great. This is a third in our speaker series, and I think, you know, in sort of the collaborations that we've had with the library, and my hope that the library continues to evolve and become the university research library that we all want it to be. And I think these this sort of speaker series again highlights that. It's really important that the library is a focal point of our sort of our research infrastructure here at UNBC. And with that, before we get to John's wonderful talk today, I think I mentioned at the first talk that we were putting together a scholarship. And so I'm happy to announce today that we have a joint scholarship between my office as well as an external funder for the Northern BC Archives Graduate Research Scholarship. It's up to 2 awards a year, valued at $5,000 each. They'll be awarded to full-time UNBC graduate students who are pursuing archival research at Northern BC Archives for their graduate thesis or project. So that's really exciting, and we're glad to be able to put that together. So the archives, as I said, has been a sort of an integral part of a lot of people's research programs. In particular, John's here today. So John is going to talk to us about the history of the university. So I don't know if this is what's out there now, or this is the behind-the-scenes stuff, the pull-back-the-curtain version this evening. So looking forward to hearing that. Because it's really important that we have that opportunity to look back and look how the university was founded and sort of its history as it's moved through up to 2015. John, of course, is a long-standing faculty member with the Department of History and been at UNBC for many, many years. And his work in sort of the criminal justice system and that has been some really seminal work. And so we're excited today to hear John's talk on the history of the university. And with that, I will turn it over to John and go from there.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. This just occurred to me as I was going over this talk earlier today. Sometime in the next 2 weeks, and I don't know the date, and I don't know if anybody knows the date, sometime in the next 2 weeks, we're going to pass the 30th anniversary of the beginning of an informal chat started by Charles Mccaffrey, then principal of the College of New Caledonia, where he, along with a couple of his buddies, Bryson Stone and Tom Stedman, would get together and drink beer and talk about the possibilities of degree completion in northern British Columbia. This book was eventually produced from that discussion that began 30 years ago. I've assembled the PowerPoint images for this afternoon's presentation not so much to illuminate my argument, or indeed to provide a roadmap for what follows, but rather as a homage of sorts to the places and people that have, in their own way, written the histories of UNBC. Hopefully, the effect will be sufficient to distract you from what I actually have to say. The quote in the title of today's talk is Kathleen Dennis's. Kathleen, as many of you will know, works in the HR department here on campus. For a number of unexplained and completely unplanned reasons, she was one of the first people who I spoke to at the beginning of the oral histories that are a key ingredient in the project that eventually produced Aspirations, a history of the University of Northern British Columbia to 2015. At the time of the interview, I was struck by the honesty and emotional clarity of Kathleen's statement. We were just so proud. And inasmuch as she was speaking of a lived experience with her own deep roots in Northern British Columbia, her words reflected my experiences as a former newcomer to the region and as someone who had my own peculiar UNBC journey through Terrace, Fort St. John, and then here to Prince George. I have made light of this journey by suggesting that I was in the Witness Protection Program. I have on a couple of previous occasions spoken in public about my authorship of this history. The first was when the book was initially launched on campus in late November 2017, and then again in March 2018 at the downtown branch of the Prince George Public Library. That occurred about a month after the book had been awarded the Gene Clark Local History Award. In truth, given that the project began roughly in the spring of 2012, it sometimes feels as if I've been talking about this forever. And no doubt a few of my colleagues will roll their eyes in pained acknowledgement that indeed I have been talking to them about the history of UNBC for far too long. For their patience and the fact that no one has, as of today at least, thrown me out of their office, I would like to thank them and acknowledge that through my 25 years of association with UNBC, the people with whom I've worked on a daily basis have provided without doubt the very best memories of this quarter century. It is, I believe, impossible to exaggerate the challenge of attracting and retaining good people, those willing to work hard, those governed by honesty and forthrightness, and those who, when they ask, "How's it going?" actually care and are willing to listen. We've been very fortunate in this regard at UNBC, and for that I am grateful. Most of these people will appear on the screen as I continue this afternoon. But rather than wholly retrace the steps from those earlier talks, while at the same time hinting broadly that the book is still for sale in the bookstore, I'd like to concentrate on a particular challenge, a historical challenge that this project laid bare. In effect, given that Ramona Rose of the Northern British Columbia Archives invested her energies in organizing the speaker series, and that the archives and the library's fourth floor occupied a central place in the research for this book, it struck me that a reflection on the challenge of working with documents in concert with oral history recollections would be an appropriate topic for this occasion. So, where to start? That, by the way, is UNBC's first football team. Writing a book such as this, in which I was one of the participants, involved genuine challenges. On the one hand, to present a celebratory account suggesting that all went according to plan and that the university leapt from success to success would have been unconvincing and, quite frankly, uninteresting. Further, I expected those familiar with the university and its history would have found such a depiction to be fanciful, if not delusional. At the same time, using the book as my own personal platform to air grievances and claim the last word in various disputes may have been intriguing, but actually it would be extremely poor taste. And indeed, more importantly, it would be a grave disservice to the university and indeed Northern British Columbians. The book couldn't be a glorified soapbox in which I delivered my version of the truth. That said, there's no pretending that the book is objective or that it's not broadly celebratory of the UNBC story going back to the mid-1980s. Like Kathleen Dennis, I too am proud to have played a small part in UNBC's history and its accomplishments after officially opening in 1994. I'll caution, however, that pride cuts in different and perhaps unexpected ways. I'll return to that before I conclude. In the summer of 1992, I was one of 8 individuals hired to teach the university's first students. And while I, along with Dee Horn, were in Terrace, other instructors were located in Prince George and Fort St. John. In all honesty, when I applied for the teaching position at UNBC, I may not have been perfectly ignorant when it came to Northern British Columbia. But from where I stood, perfect ignorance could be seen without a great deal of squinting. For instance, one of my first thoughts was that of all things considered, it would be nice to work at a campus built on the West Coast. Yes, I thought Prince George was Prince Rupert. Second, although I was puzzled by the rationale behind the plan, I thought it intriguing that the University of Northern British Columbia would have one of its campuses at Dawson City in the Yukon. Yes, I had confused Dawson Creek with Dawson City. In fact, before flying out to Terrace for my interview, I had never been in Northern British Columbia. So, as I suggested, if it was not perfect ignorance, it was dangerously close. Still, when offered the position with the university, I leapt at the opportunity. My thinking was simple. UNBC would provide a solid foundation of teaching experience, and after 4 or 5 years, I'd move on. A quarter of a century later, I'm still here. It is, I suppose, a qualification of sorts. A summary of the book might be as follows. I briefly sketched the story of post-secondary education in the Northern Interior before tracing the events that eventually led to the creation of the Interior University Society. I then turned to the Society's campaign to build an autonomous, freestanding university in the province's Northern Interior, mapping how the IUS navigated through a blizzard of obstacles and challenges while marshaling support from across the region before it eventually secured the government's backing of the initiative. Further, and as much as that 8-year battle is extraordinary, it was merely the beginning of the commitment that followed the university's opening, its response to the arrival of students, its response to the growing demands of the community, and its recognition that new initiatives and new strategies for strengthening the institution and its links with Northern British Columbia would be needed. It also signaled the onset of persistent challenges to the long-term viability of the UNBC project. As a historian, my approach relied on the documentary record for concrete details that could be confirmed through comparison with other external sources. Now, there is no question that the documentary record can be flawed. Errors or outright fabrications are easily written down and taken on authority that in truth they don't deserve. But as we teach our history majors, every source, no matter what its form, must answer to rigorous examination. No account, regardless of its nature, gets a free pass. Located in the archives in the library's fourth floor are these documents retained by a number of individuals who were participants in the IUS campaign. Not surprisingly, there is a fair bit of overlap and repetition in these records. This offers the benefit that if one collection is missing a specific document, it's likely that others will have copies or perhaps even the original document itself. First, when cross-examined and then drawn together into a chronology, I think it arguable that the archive has as near a complete set of documents as possible, at least on the campaign to build the university in the northern interior. This, of course, is a great boon for historians. On the other hand, it must be acknowledged that the university, as an institution, has done a poor job of transferring its records to the archive and ensuring that it is financed in a manner guaranteeing the preservation of UNBC's ongoing documentary heritage. That the archive holds these records provides several advantages. I relied on these documents to fashion a timeline of events, not just when something occurred, but just as importantly, when evidence demonstrated that something did not occur. In effect, the documents provided an anchor and provided me from getting swept up in events or carried away. At their best, documents keep your feet on the ground. Second, while all historical documents are liable to obscure as much as they reveal, and thus need to be approached with a disciplined and critical eye, I'd argue they have a clear advantage over their oral histories in one important sense. The documentary heritage in the archives are not prejudiced by success. Specifically, the key advantage of a letter, a memo, or an executive summary written in 1988 is that it was composed without any knowledge, any awareness of what the future held. Certainly, such a document might have spin, hopes, expectations, or some other flavoring. But the one thing it can't do is frame the events of the day with specific knowledge of how the history would play out. For instance, at one moment during the implementation planning group, former president of the IUS, Elsie Gerdes, just about lost it completely. She was so frustrated with the slow progress of discussions. And her notes are this wonderful spider mass of complaints and really reading the riot act to her fellow committee members. And what's so wonderful is that we not only have Elsie's notes, we have everybody else's notes documenting just how mad Elsie was. And so you can cross-compare and then capture the moment unlike any other source. And because they're written at the time, they don't know how the story, or in this particular case, the history, will end. As such, these documents bear witness to the enormous doubt, the pervasive uncertainty, and yes, the fear that no matter what the early enthusiasts wished to believe, the campaign was, from the outset, fighting an uphill battle. This, I believe, is extremely important for all Northern British Columbians to appreciate and remember. These documents demonstrate with absolute certainty that nothing was guaranteed. And in fact, the most likely result of the Interior University Society campaign was some minor tinkering with funding for the College of New Caledonia, or perhaps the transformation of that institution into a university college. After all, we cannot forget that establishing a new institution anywhere in the province, let alone in the northern interior, was directly contrary to stated government policy in the late 1980s. Third, when used in conjunction with the oral history interviews, to which I'll turn in a moment, the documents provide a rich opportunity to ask participants about their own evolving sense of events. Although this often generated some consternation on the part of interview subjects, I was in a position to compare what they had written or argued in 1991, for instance, and how that aligned or did not align with what they recalled in their interview in 2013. At its best, these active comparisons between what the individual did, thought, or believed at one particular point in time, and how the passage of time gave rise to differing notions, provided splendid moments through which we see that history is always a dynamic conversation between past and present. As much as the paper record provided opportunities and difficulties, the challenges of the oral history evidence were of a very different nature. Specifically, and unlike the documentary record, every individual who was interviewed, about 90 people in total, every individual knew how the story ended. Quite literally, despite the enormous doubt, pervasive uncertainty, and the fear that no matter what the early enthusiasts did, they were not assured of success. These recollections were colored by the knowledge that the campaign did, in the end, achieve what it set out to accomplish. This was the problem with success. Individuals who were there at the outset, as well as those who heard stories about the campaign, the petition, or the seemingly endless public talks, the IUS dog and pony show that crossed and recrossed northern British Columbia from the Peace River Liard to Haida Gwaii to Tet Jun Junction, unconsciously knitted their knowledge of the campaign into its successful conclusion and then into their own recollections. As a result, the fact of success colored the portrayal of every decision that seemingly moved the campaign closer to its goal, while it painted as unthinking villains those who voiced doubts or who were not won over by the campaign at all. Allow me to pause and provide you with a very specific example of how success distorted the remembrances of the IUS campaign. Essentially, because it set out to establish a university and that in time UNBC emerged, it is all too easy to believe that there had been a well-developed blueprint that led in lockstep to the building of a university. The reflected glow of this success led some to assume that Charles Mccaffrey, Tom Stedman, Murray Sadler, Ron East, Dale McMahon, Valerie Cordyban, Elsie Gerdes, Myron Sambad, and others were visionaries. In effect, collectively and individually, their sense, it appeared, their sense of the future was somehow grander, more expansive than the average northern British Columbian. Yet to a person, everyone on that list rejected this characterization. Murray Sadler, for one, argued time and time again that not only were they not visionaries, most of the time they were over their heads and scrambling to figure out what might work next. Tom Stedman's throwaway line was that as a hammer merchant, the only way he could get into a university was to build one. Now, inasmuch as this might be seen as these denials seen as false modesty, I don't believe that actually tells the story. Certainly, these people were dedicated and ultimately sacrificed an enormous amount of time and energy in what became a quest to build a university. Somewhere, each individual crossed their own Rubicon, and without any deep forethought, became entangled in what turned out to be an 8-year battle. In fact, a number of the community founders acknowledged that had they known at the outset how much time and effort the project was to consume, they may have reconsidered their involvement. Further, I'd argue that this in of itself, this inference that they were visionaries, is dangerous. It implies that Northern British Columbians, it implies that if Northern British Columbia is to move forward, we have to await the appearance of visionaries. Rather, every one of those folks in the IUS made a very similar argument. The campaign did not succeed because of its leaders being visionaries, especially that guy. It succeeded because workaday Northern British Columbians got on board and took ownership of what the region's future might be and how a university could be a keystone in creating that future. It is perhaps one of the most important lessons of the UNBC story, but all too often it's overlooked in favor of tidier conclusions about the necessities of visionaries. My own awareness that memory could be tricky motivated the decision early on in the project to have researcher Stephanie Leong interview me before I became immersed in the documentary record and the rising tide of oral history interviews. Practically, it was useful for Stephanie to get comfortable with steering an interview, while on the other hand, it was important that my own remembrances were largely unaffected by what I was about to learn. Essentially, the idea was that by getting my interview out of the way, my own misperceptions, prejudices, ignorance, and knowledge would be neither bolstered nor mitigated by the documentary evidence and the recollections of others. I've not listened to my interview since. I have no illusions that I offered views that I've since altered or abandoned. There is no question that my outlook changed as a consequence of having listened to all the other interviews, as well as having been reviewed, as well as having reviewed the archival documents and the newspaper accounts. And as I drafted chapters and attempted to sharpen my sense of the university's history and evolution, I continued to amend, to edit, and to sharpen my sense of that history as well as UNBC's future prospects. An allied challenge with the interviews was evident in those involving founding faculty and staff. In some ways, though, it was almost the opposite of the success effect. Although not absolute, there are exceptions to this. Most of the founding faculty and staff, those who were here from 1992 to 1996, and who were still on hand in 2013 and 2014, articulated disappointment and frustration with the seeming disappearance of the sense of commitment and mission that had apparently characterized the early years of UNBC. Some voiced the view that we were more of a community during the early startup phase, that we had a better original vision of the university, that vision articulated by founding President Jeff Weller, was apparently preferable to that which developed later. In effect, the complaint amounted to the assertion that we, as we grew, we lost something. Those familiar with studies of oral histories will recognize the phenomena of imagining the past as invariably better and less complicated. Somehow our thinking was more effective. Our planning was more responsive. Somehow we were smarter back then. And just as the documentary record revealed that the grassroots campaign had never been a sure thing, the same record indicates that rolling out the original academic and campus plans for the university, the building of the initial curriculum and academic calendars were fraught enterprises with an enormous amount of stress, strain, and anxiety. Those good old days involved 60 to 70-hour work weeks filled with meetings that blurred into each other. At its best, the documentary record acts as a corrective and disabuses us of any notions that we were necessarily smarter or more astute in the past. Rather, I suspect that the more accurate conclusion is that those who were there at the founding of the university and who participated in our interviews were now actually just more skeptical and world-weary than they once had been. I think it important to stress that there's no reason to believe that these collisions between the oral recollections and the documentary evidence are products of willful misrepresentation by the participants. I simply do not believe that to be the case. Rather, what we see is that human experience rarely falls into neat and tidy categories. Indeed, dealing with this unvarnished reality is the historian's labor. Sorting the sandpaper truths, the half-remembered circumstance, and the best intentions in the hope of untangling how it was that these collisions, near misses, and resurrected memories told a story, or, as I mentioned earlier, told a history. Further, wrestling with what might be irreconcilables is one of the skills that we try to impart to our history students. It is a disposition to sift through the evidence in search of a compelling conclusion that drives our inquiries. In fact, when presented with those rare instances wherein the available evidence seemingly agrees, is when we become particularly suspicious that something is not quite right. There will always be contradictions. There will always be departures, distinctions, and outright disagreements within any historic or contemporary record detailing human behavior. This is a hard truth. This is the nature of the thing. And rather than dedicating resources to tidying up the inherently messy documents and inconsistent accounts of any human society, we are better off asking whether we as a university are investing sufficient resources to ensure that our students, and through them, our communities, are sufficiently tooled up to handle these challenges. Suffice us to say that the swirl of contemporary events has demonstrated the value and importance of such a disposition. This habit of mind and discipline to sort BS from brilliance in a time when an engaged and thoughtful citizenry is so badly needed. So, where does this leave us? Many of you, no doubt, have your own UNBC stories, memories, sense of its history, sense of its contributions to Northern British Columbia. I've been fortunate to have had the opportunity of putting my version of history down on paper and then see it between the covers of a book. But at the same time, I retain no illusions that the book is the history of UNBC. At its best, it is merely a history. Indeed, I'd argue that it's one of many. Further, I'd hope that it would spawn more histories in the future that can launch their inquiries cataloging how horribly wrong I got the story. After all, if the documentary record and the oral histories offer up a truth, it is that there are uncounted versions of the university's history. They are carried by every individual who has passed through the agora on their way to a meeting, to a workshop, to a lab, to a lecture, or off to work in the library. There are versions of the university carried by those who have sat on committees, served food in the cafeteria or the Thirsty Moose, been a subject in a university research project, delivered counsel to students, or walked across the convocation stage to accept a degree. And in many instances, just like Kathleen Dennis, these people too were just so very proud of what their association with UNBC had provided. But inasmuch as I can applaud that pride, I hope it rests in large part on the clear understanding that nothing about the establishment of a university in Northern Interior was fated. UNBC was created and will continue to stand only because of the commitment and dedication of Northern British Columbians. No one gave us a university. And just because that battle was won and the university has gone onward for over a quarter century since the passage of the UNBC Act, and that we're now 18 months away from the 25th anniversary of the 1994 September launch of the first full slate of classes, we must nonetheless remain on our guard. As I concluded in the book, this duty to resist the temptation of resting on our laurels is a daunting responsibility. In a sense, it implies an obligation to take up the task from those community founders and university personnel who began this journey. Equally, it carries an expectation that the university be prepared to play their part in forwarding Northern British Columbia's interests. That requires that all Northern British Columbians, regardless of political stripe or disposition, must maintain constant pressure on our elected representatives, whether in opposition or in government. We, as a community, will be disadvantaged if UNBC is orphaned by political expediency and the ham-fisted illogic of austerity. We will carry the burden if our interests, our concerns, our communities, and our futures are relegated to the back burner in favor of more vocal and influential parts of the province. We need to produce students with sharp minds and critical skills so that they possess the means to speak truth to power. I'd suggest that such a result represents a fitting legacy to those workaday Northern British Columbians who, in the latter half of 1987, wondered what it would take to reimagine the future of an entire region. Thank you.
All right, now we get to a chance to have John Swainger off script.
Now the swearing begins.
Questions or comments?
Thank you, John. Very good. Enjoyed it very much. So you spoke very fulsomely about the importance of the archives and the documentary evidence. But when you came to the oral interviews, you were perhaps, there was a note of, well, approach them with caution. But you nevertheless did 90 of them. So I was just wondering, well, what were your takeaways? What did you get out of doing the 90 interviews other than that they're unreliable?
Well, it's not just that they aren't reliable, because they are reliable for very different things that a documentary record is useful for. The oral interviews are splendid for capturing the excitement, the degree to which people have been transformed by their association with the Interior University Society campaign. The fact that workaday Northern British Columbians were prepared to go out and bang on their neighbors' doors to sign petitions. You really got that sense of excitement, whereas in the documents, you sort of got this sense of foreboding that this was, if not a fool's errand, very close to a fool's errand. But with the oral interviews, you get that sense of, my gosh, this is going to be a brilliant thing. People were genuinely excited. It's one of those wonderful contributions of the IUS campaign that for the first time in Northern British Columbia's history, we got a cross-region political movement. It didn't matter what party you were from. It did not matter what community you were from. It did not matter at all. The vast majority of Northern British Columbians were on board. And that was the first time in the region. You know, the history of Northern British Columbia is shaped by sort of a divide and conquer policy approach. Well, here was an occasion where Northern British Columbians said no to that no, we're going to speak as one, and we're going to get a university. So that human sense of the drama is really there. And then, you know, the interviews of our colleagues, with the exception of you, everybody worked really hard. You know, I mean, it's just unreal how hard people worked in those early years. And we burned out people at an alarming rate because 60 to 70-hour weeks were not unusual. And so you really get that sense of just how hard people were prepared to pitch in. And then conversely, later when they're looking back at things, they wonder about the absence of that willingness. So it's that sense of loss of, once we were like this, what's happened to us? So you get a much more complicated human picture from the oral history interview. So I don't want to leave anybody with the impression that they're just dead wrong, because they're not. They just tell a very different story.
John, there was a question that was emailed in,
Right.
Related to the founders. Is there a need to continue dialogue with them, or would that impede UNBC's progress? If such a need would be beneficial, what voice could exist as a reminder of original aspirations, implementation processes, and challenges?
One of the challenges of continually going back to the original founders is that at a certain point, haven't they done enough? An anecdote from up in Fort St. John. We were at a meeting with the local Friendship Society, and one of the elders stood up. And they were talking about the parade in the upcoming rodeo season. And one of the elders stood up and she said in a very firm voice, "I'm sick and tired of being an Indian." You know, she didn't want to be the prototypical Indian on the float anymore. Well, it's like with the founders. They must be tired of being the founders. And so, isn't it time for another generation to start carrying this ball? I imagine that Tom Stedman and Murray Sadler and Myron Sambad and people like that are kind of sick and tired of getting emails from us. Now, at the same time, I think that they have an important role to play if they want it, as sort of the gray-haired eminence, to talk about things that didn't work, to talk about other approaches and perhaps ideas that were abandoned initially. But as much as, I would like to exploit Tom Stedman and other people as much as possible, I think at a certain time we need to take responsibility for our community. And maybe another generation of founders, that every graduating class of UNBC needs to be a generation of founders. Maybe they need to take up the task as well, because it's their communities as well. Okay? Other queries, rude comments?
Nobody's really set him off yet.
I think they've had enough.
So I have a question. Have you ever been tempted to have Stephanie or anybody else ask you the very same questions on tape that she asked you at the beginning, and just for interest, see what the difference
to
looks
redo the interview? Yeah. One of the this is being recorded, eh? One of the things I said on the interview that was probably inappropriate, yeah, it was. I described a past president of the university not as a casserole, but it rhymed with casserole. And no, it wasn't him. That was untoward. That was a little bit too much. But that's literally the only thing I remember saying that I regret. But like I say, I have not listened to that. So as much as I've said, my ideas have changed. And I know they've changed. I have a hard time identifying what the specifics would be. That said, I think it would be fascinating to find out how far I traveled in this particular journey and the degree to which I've moderated some of my opinions and some of my perspectives, and the degree to which I've gotten pretty starchy about some of the other ones that, I have a real hate on for the Ministry of Advanced Education. I make that perfectly clear in the book. I think they were our enemy. And to the degree it's at all helpful, Charles Mccaffrey, when I interviewed him months before he died, Charles Mccaffrey said to me, the one thing you have to remember is the government is the enemy. Now, this was one of the leaders of the movement. And Mccaffrey was certainly a bit of a disturber. But, it's an extraordinary outlook. But having been exposed to the evidence, I get that. I understand what he was saying. That with every step, the Ministry of Advanced Education tried to thwart the IUS. They flew Murray Sadler twice down to the States to show him a polytechnic, to say, wouldn't you like this more than just a university? Twice. This was after the UNBC Act had been signed into existence. They're still trying to roll it back into a university college. So there's stuff like that that, as a consequence of having been exposed to the evidence, I've certainly changed my mind, without question. Yeah. Now I'm in trouble.
John, picking up on the last question and your comments, I think that theme transcends UNBC. I think that's the Northern BC story. Whether it was establishing the medical school, which was determined by the Deputy Minister of Advanced Education to be ludicrous, or whether it was the Cancer Center here in Prince George, all of them you had to fight this terrible resistance from government that started by saying this will never happen.
Right.
So it goes beyond the UNBC story,
Right.
And I think it's what we have to deal with, whether in healthcare or education in Northern BC.
And I think what's so important is that the UNBC solution of getting cross-regional, cross-party support really mattered, because it didn't matter who was in government. The message was the same. You will do this or else. And that mattered. When 16,000 signatures show up during a cabinet meeting, Bill Vander Zalm, then Premier, says, we got a problem here, folks. Because up to that point in time, it didn't look like northern British Columbians were really on board. But now 16,000 had signed this petition, had paid $5 a head minimum to sign that petition. 16,000 voters are saying, do this. Darn right they had a problem because they were exposed in terms of how many seats they might lose in northern British Columbia. So that kind of cross-regional stuff works, but it takes a lot of organization, a lot of commitment, and ordinary northern British Columbians wanting to get out there and push the issue.
Just to expand on that, Murray Sadler, Tom Stedman traveled throughout the North over and over again to sell the idea of the university. I and others did the same around the medical program, did the same around the cancer program, because it's not divide and conquer, I don't think. It's that we live in separate solitudes, and you have to overcome that narrow regional parochialism that is also part of the makeup of northern British Columbia.
Which interestingly enough was one of the first things that the founders wanted as a program at northern British Columbia, was creating a political culture that could make those leaps, could break down distance, break down the fact that we were isolated, dispersed communities separated by vast distances. That was one of their first projects for UNBC, because they wanted UNBC to be a hothouse for ideas to solve the problems of northern British Columbians and then deliver those solutions to the government. That's what the founders wanted us to do. That we wouldn't be coming to the government cap in hand. Rather, we would be delivering them solutions. Here's the problem, here's the solution, let's get at her. That's what they wanted the university to be. I'm being waved at.
We have a question from one of our live stream viewers. Thank you, Jonathan. I deeply appreciated your passion and articulation of your views and research. The statement for that UNBC to expand, we will need visionaries. Will you expand on that? What do you see are the conditions where visionaries have a place in UNBC to evolve the vision? Are there any indicators of what that might look like in the next decade? Also, does the university in the North, for the North, is it still relevant from what you've seen? I personally love this focus because I believe we have just begun.
I want to clarify. I mean, I don't think we need to be hoping for the next visionary. I think that's very dangerous, because it means, therefore, then we're waiting for some woman or man to thrust themselves forward and I have all the answers. This worked because workaday northern British Columbians got on board. So it wasn't a mayor or our regional council. It was everyone. All the school boards got on side. All the First Nations communities got on side. Businesses got on side. Unions got on side. Entrepreneurs got on side. So this wasn't driven by visionaries. I firmly believe that waiting for visionaries is going to be a long wait. But that the community writ large, if we decide to act in concert, then things will begin to change. So I'm not entirely convinced that visionaries are the answer. But again, this starts to get to that very dangerous territory of a historian talking about contemporary policy. And we do a lot of things, but contemporary policy is perhaps not one of our strong suits. Now, that's it. In the North and for the North is intriguing. I suspect, though, in all honesty, it's kind of run its course. If we're going to be talking about the global influences on northern British Columbia, if we're going to be talking about the fact that the world has shrunk, if we're going to be talking about the challenges of telecommunications over vast distances in space, if we're going to be talking about cryptocurrencies, does a discourse rooted solely in the idea of in the North and for the North, how well will that move us forward? All right? And I know that doesn't align with the way that we've branded ourselves for a long time. But I wonder if that's run its course. I would be perhaps more interested in the selling of the university, in the notion of, we're your university. What is your university going to do for you? I mean, breaking down those boundaries so that rather than those students in Terrace going down the West Coast because that's where they're drawn, or those students up in the Northeast going to U of A because that's where they're drawn, do we give potential students a sense that we are one there for them and that we are their university? I have no idea. You know, are we your you? I have no idea if we sell that message. I really don't know what kind of message will make sense to students in this contemporary environment. But at the same time, I'm increasingly convinced that in the North and for the North, and yes, the green U might be too narrow. I think we might need to be more expansive than that. I've just spoken heresy. I've got the folks online mad now.
This is a question from our Dr. Daniel Weeks.
Uh-oh.
He says, wonderful talk. Thank you, John. You ended by saying that people were speculating about what the future might bring with a university. Has the experience of writing this book led you to speculate about the next 25 years?
Yeah, it has. And in all candor, I'm worried. And I mean, this is admittedly a bit of a downer. I've said, Dr. Binema has heard me say this many, many times to the degree that it sounds like sort of just chatter. I've said I don't know if UNBC is going to be here in 25 years. And I've said that over and over and over again. Because right now, my goal for UNBC is pretty simple. I would like to see us with a student body of 4,000 FTE. Are we anywhere near that? Are we at a point where campus is heaving with people? Are we at a point where all of our classes are filled to the brim? What are we going to do to attract and retain students from across the disciplines? That, to me, is the challenge. And again, it goes back to our identity and our branding. What will draw students here? What will we offer that they can't get elsewhere? Because maybe, in all honesty, we are going to have a hard time competing with the big schools in specific areas. But are we offering our students an experience that they will not get elsewhere? It's like buying an iPhone. You buy the iPhone in part because of the identity it gives you, because of the cachet that goes with the iPhone, when in fact the technicians tell us Samsung phones are probably better. Well, why are people prepared to pay more for the iPhone than they are for a Samsung? Because there's a cachet that goes with it. What's the cachet that goes with UNBC? What's the added extra? What's the more? You know, and I mean, that discussion can go all over the yard. But I think that's the more important discussion for our future. And President Weeks has been very kind to steal hook, line, and sinker assertions I've made in the books. Bless him. But the point is that until we get this enrollment thing under control, everything, the last 25 years, exists on a bed of sand. Until we have 4,000 students pouring through our front door each and every semester, this has been built on a bed of sand. That is, for me, the unvarnished truth. All right? And Dr. Jago and Ted Binema and some of you oldsters were here when this place was heaving with students, when the parking lots were full, when they had to change the driving pattern around the circle because there was nowhere to park on campus, where history courses of all things had to offer multiple sections because we couldn't serve the students with single sections anymore. The place was heaving. And then something happened. And it's in the book what happened. What happened was Thompson Rivers University. The granting of all these universities across the country, across the province, drained our student base. So now we've got to figure out a way to attract students in a different sense. And part of it, I think, is to offer them a cachet of something that they won't get anywhere else. Yes, you can get a chemistry degree. Yes, you can get a history degree. You can get an anthropology degree at UBC. But at UNBC, you get that degree, and then you get something more. What's that more? What is that? What is that cachet that means our students will be going around popping buttons of how proud they are to be a product of UNBC? What's that cachet? That will be our future. And if we don't get a hold of that, I don't know if we'll be here in 25 years, to be quite honest. I know that's a downer, but I just don't know. Now Dan Weeks is going to fire me. Bethany up in the cheap seats. You saw that picture, Bethany? I did. There you go.
I know, 22 then and still
You got the
looking good
screen
now.
all to yourself as well.
I noticed that, John.
I'll
Thank
expect
you.
$5 later.
I really appreciated your presentation, and you know, it's interesting because I think you're right. I think we have to broaden ourselves, and I appreciate having an international perspective and not just a northern perspective. And we had a UNBC staff member who has since left UNBC, and she wished to remain anonymous, but I loved her take on things. And she said, the first 25 years was just a dress rehearsal. And I truly believe in that as staff members and as faculty and administrators, that we are all working together to make UNBC viable for the next 25.
Right.
So,
Right.
Thank
you,
you
Bethany.
very much.
Appreciate it.
Well, maybe that's a great way to end before John introduces yet another downer. So.
Yeah, more doom.
So we'll thank him one more time, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.